great pleasure and honour it is to be here, and I'd also like to thank the sponsors for their extraordinary generosity. I've never slept in such a large bed in all of my life, so thank you. I'm going to begin my talk with a story about a neuroscientist. She's an expert in impulsive desire, that immediate gut feeling of I want it or I like it, that certain things or people automatically evoke in us, sometimes quite powerfully, but other times so mildly that it barely even penetrates consciousness. She begins experimenting with transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, which is a brain technology that can interfere with the excitation of neurons. And she's interested in whether she can create or change impulsive desires by using TMS to interfere with a part of the brain involved in those desires. And being practically minded, her plan is to use TMS while exposing people to consumer products. And if all goes to plan, she'll be able to change the person's impulsive desire for the product. Our neuroscientist meets a colleague, and she tells him about her idea. But the colleague is confused. He says, "But you're only changing people's impulsive desires. If you're not changing what people actually think or believe about the product, why would their buying behavior change?" The neuroscientist laughs at his naivety. She points out that depending on the product category, consumer choices are spontaneous as much as 80% of the time. "Trust me," she says. "If I create a normal, everyday kind of consumer situation, distracted, time-pressured, spontaneous, the brain manipulation will work." Her colleague is skeptical. He sets her a challenge, the Pepsi challenge. He says, "I'm going to find you a group of people who have absolutely no preference between Coke and Pepsi. Now you're telling me with this TMS of yours, you can make them more likely to choose one brand over the other, even though they think they're the same." Our neuroscientist says, "Just watch me." And so he brings her a group of participants who have no preference for Coke or Pepsi. The neuroscientist shows them images of Pepsi and Coke, and with half of them, she uses the TMS to increase the impulsive desire level of Pepsi and decrease the impulsive desire level of Coke. And with the other half of the participants, she does the opposite. Then she asks them questions like, "Which would you be more likely to buy at the supermarket, Pepsi or Coke?" And the participants say, "Well, neither. I'd be equally likely to buy either one." And then finally, the neuroscientist offers them a choice of Coke or Pepsi, supposedly by way of thanks for taking part in the experiment. And she lets half of them make the choice without anything else on their minds. And here in green is the number that chose the brand that was paired with the impulsive desire decreasing to TMS. And here in red are the number that chose the brand that was paired with the impulsive desire increasing TMS. It hasn't worked. But what about the second group? The second group are given the same choice, but just before, the neuroscientist distracts them. She asks them to hold in their mind a 7-digit number that they'll have to recite after their choice. And the reasoning is that with their mental effort and attention devoted to this quite difficult task, their choice will be delegated to autopilot, and they'll be more likely to follow their impulsive desires in making their choice. So what do these distracted participants do? Just as she predicted, they show a distinct preference for whichever soft drink has been paired with the impulsive desire increasing TMS. Its market share increases from a fair 50%, given that the participants have no preference for either brand, to a decidedly advantageous 70%. Now our neuroscientist wants to see if she can use TMS to create an impulsive desire for a new brand. She gets another group of participants. She shows them images of 2 new soft drink brands called Enorm and Energy Slammer. She zapped half of them with the impulsive desire increasing TMS when they're looking at Enorm, and she zapped the rest of them when they're looking at Energy Slammer pictures. Then, a little bit later, she invites them to try one of the 2 drinks. Here in green is how many people chose the soft drink that was not paired with the desire increasing TMS. And here in red is how many people chose the drink that was paired with TMS. This time, the neuroscientist didn't even have to distract them. At this point, faced with the evidence of her influence over the consumer brain, the neuroscientist begins to feel a few qualms about her TMS technology. She imagines it being used to increase impulsive desires for alcohol, for junk food, for expensive brands, for unnecessary, pointless products that are used once and thrown away. She wonders, is it ethical to interfere with the brain, to create impulsive desires that people have no rational reason to want, and may indeed have rational reasons not to want? What do you think? And remember your answer to this question. The neuroscientist pushes away the nagging anxieties and starts work on a new project, a chemical spray that interferes with the neurotransmitters that underlie self-control. She tests it out in 2 experiments. In the first experiment, she asks her participants how important it is to control their eating, and in the second experiment, their alcoholic intake. She also measures their impulsive desires for M&Ms, and in the second experiment, for beer. Then she gives them the opportunity to eat as many M&Ms, or in the second experiment, drink as much beer as they like. Now here are the graphs of consumption for the people who are not exposed to the self-control depleting spray. And these show that the more important it is to people to control their eating or drinking, which are the lines shown in green, the less they eat and the less they drink. And the strength of the impulsive desire, which is shown in red, doesn't have much bearing on consumption. But when she uses the spray, the results are completely different. Now, a greater conscious preference for control, again in green, is no longer associated with less consumption. In fact, in the case of the M&Ms, the more you want not to eat, the more you eat. And now it's the strength of the impulsive desire in red that predicts how much people eat or drink. The stronger the desire, the greater the consumption. Looking at her results, our neuroscientist feels again the unease of moral uncertainty. Is it ethical to manipulate the brain in order to weaken self-control so that people are more likely to fall back on their impulsive desires and behave in ways they would prefer not to behave? What do you think? Remember your answer to this question. The neuroscientist realizes that she has in her hands a powerful way of manipulating consumer behavior. The TMS creates or enhances an impulsive desire, and the spray weakens the capacity to resist that desire. In other words, her neuroscientific tools will enable marketers to benefit themselves by undermining people's autonomy, that is, their ability to act in the way that they have judged to be best for themselves. She shreds her results, she throws away the spray. I told you that this was a story, and it is. But the story wasn't all made up. Neuroscientists do not yet have techniques to manipulate our impulsive desires or, short of brain surgery, to reduce our capacity for self-control. But psychologists do. The data I showed you were real, and they all came from recent psychology experiments using simple, everyday items and activities. In fact, these experiments are so simple that I'm going to recreate one for you now. In a moment, I'm going to show you a series of pictures up on the screen as quickly as I can, given the constraints of this. I want you to look at each picture carefully, and every time you see either the word Mountain Dew or this picture of the Mountain Dew brand, I want you to raise your hand and then lower it again quickly, ready for the next slide in your next sighting. Okay? You ready? Go. Oh. Okay, good. That was more of a test for me than you, I think. That was a real manual dexterity problem. Okay, you look like you're all pretty good at spotting Mountain Dew, but the experiment was actually about something else altogether. So many of you will have noticed that there were pictures of Coke and Pepsi as well as Mountain Dew. But what's less likely that you would have noticed was that in the slides, Pepsi was always paired with nice pictures and words, and Coke was always paired with nasty pictures and words. Sorry, I'm struggling with this. Okay, we'll leave that up for the sponsor, one of the Pepsi, who are the sponsors. Okay, now, so basically the experiment involved a very crude kind of advertising, and in the actual experiment there were 20 images each of Pepsi and Coke with these pairings of nice and nasty things. Just like in our imaginary experiment with the neuroscientists, the participants began the experiment with no preference for Pepsi and Coke. Half of them, like you, saw Pepsi paired with nice things, Coke with nasty. The other half saw Coke paired with nice things and Coke paired with nasty things. So the question is, what happens in your mind when these slides are flashed before you? Well, the answer depends on what mind you mean. Many psychologists argue that there are 2 kinds of thinking or mental process. And one tiny fraction of our mental life is made up of reflective processes. And this is the mind as we experience it consciously, the mind that reasons, deliberates, decides, attends, and wills. And this part of the mind was attending to Mountain Dew. It may have noticed the Pepsi and Coke images, but it probably didn't notice the correlation with good and bad, and even if it did, this would hardly bring about a change in your reflected opinion about the two brands. I mean, why should it? And indeed, when the researcher of this study, Brian Gibson, asked his participants about their buying preferences for Pepsi or Coke after seeing the slides, they all said that they would still have no preference. Does that mean when people say that advertising doesn't influence them, they're right? Well, not necessarily. The other kind of mental processes we have are the automatic processes, what Malcolm Gladwell has nicely described as thinking what thinking, with thinking without thinking, or the social psychologist Brian Nozick has defined as the mind as it operates automatically, unintentionally, or unconsciously. And the automatic mind learns by picking up correlations in the environment, what tends to go with what. And it can be thought of as a tangled, complex network of associations between concepts, attitudes, behaviours, goals, feelings, motivations, and so on. And the strength of each association reflects the correlations you've experienced over your life. And one of the most basic things to be learned about an object or stimulus is whether it's good or bad. If we often experience a product at the same time as we experience other stimuli that make us feel good, then the automatic system will pick up the correlation. And critically, this kind of associative learning seems to be truth blind. It doesn't seem to matter if there's something false or misleading about the correlation, or something unreliable or biased about the source. And equally importantly, this kind of learning requires neither our attention, nor our awareness, nor our intent. It doesn't matter if we're not paying attention to the product. It doesn't matter if we're not aware of the marketing. The product or brand can still acquire an automatic emotional appeal, an impulsive desirability. So what's happening in our minds automatically without our intention and without our awareness when we're shown the Pepsi and Coke slides? Well, the idea is that the automatic associations of the mind are activated in a way that enhances the impulsive desire for Pepsi and decreases the impulsive desire for Coke. And Gibson saw evidence that this had happened in a well-established reaction time-based test that's frequently used to tap into the automatic appeal of stimuli. So how did this change in impulsive desire affect their consumer behaviour when, after seeing the slides, the participants were offered a choice of Pepsi and Coke? Just like in our imaginary experiment before, there were both undistracted and distracted volunteers. And of course, you've already seen the results of this particular experiment. Oh, there it is. Of course, in this real experiment, though, the grabbing of market share was achieved not with transcranial magnetic stimulation, but with flowers and smiling couples. What about creating an impulsive desire for a novel brand? Again, this is very easy. In a study published this year, psychologists asked participants to look through a digital magazine. And there were 41 pages altogether. And 10 of the pages looked something like this. They paired a soft drink brand with a funny cartoon. And another 10 looked like this. So they paired the other brand with an unfunny cartoon. And the participants were asked to attend to what was framed in yellow, in other words, the cartoon, funny or unfunny, rather than the picture of the soft drink. And the remaining pages of the magazine were just fillers, they were just distractors. Afterwards, the participants took another reaction time-based test to assess their impulsive desire for the two brands. And the experience of flipping through this magazine, which took a total of about 7 minutes, successfully increased the participants' impulsive desire for whichever soft drink brand had been paired with the funny cartoons. So how did this influence their behaviour as consumers when the researchers offered them an opportunity to try one of the soft drinks? Well, of course, you've already seen these data. These are how many chose the ones that were paired with the unfunny cartoon. These are how many people chose the drink that was paired with a funny cartoon. This biasing of behaviour towards one brand over the other was achieved not with transcranial magnetic stimulation, but with cartoons. The uncomfortable conclusion that these and a growing number of very similar recent experiments point to is that our environments, including those ever-increasing portions of our environment that are controlled or influenced by marketers, can be arranged in ways that manipulate our impulsive desires without our awareness. So what if marketers, in response to these kinds of results, shifted their focus from the traditional goals of marketing, which are to attract attention, to stick in conscious memory, to persuade, and instead began to devote their efforts to capturing the automatic mind without us even noticing. We might start to see an increase in unobtrusive, unmemorable forms of marketing, product placement you don't even notice, inconspicuous logos on funny websites, voiceovers by celebrities not quite famous enough for you to recognize their voices, cute puppies trained to sit next to billboards bearing a company logo. If this happens, should we care? Earlier, I asked you, is it ethical to interfere with the brain to create impulsive desires that people have no rational reason to want, and may indeed have rational reasons not to want? If you objected to the idea of neuromarketers manipulating us in this way, why should ordinary marketers be allowed to manipulate the environment in ways that have identical effects? So I've shown you how to create an impulsive desire using simple everyday household items. How do we exhaust self-control? Again, very easy. Social psychologist Roy Baumeister refers to self-control or any form of self-regulation as the moral muscle, because, as dozens of experiments are now showing, like a real muscle made of mere flesh and blood, when you use it, it gets tired for a short period of time. And in many experiments, Baumeister and others have shown that when we exert self-control in one domain, like resisting the temptation of eating cookies, then shortly afterwards we'll show less self-control, even in a completely different domain of self-regulation, like suppressing our emotion or performing an effortful mental task like reasoning. And in response to this kind of research, psychologists are now beginning to look at the effects of weakening the moral muscle on consumption. And in 2 recent experiments, researchers showed participants a clip from a highly emotionally charged film. And some participants were told to just let their emotions run free when they watched the film. And the remainder of the participants were asked to suppress their emotions as they watched, which is a form of self-regulation and therefore depletes the moral muscle. And then, in a supposedly unrelated taste test experiment, they were let loose on the M&Ms or on beer in the second experiment. Now, of course, as you already know, you've already seen the data from these experiments. Those with a fresh moral muscle were guided by their conscious preference for control rather than their impulsive desires. But those whose moral muscles were fatigued were guided by their impulsive desires. No chemical spray required. The philosopher Neil Levy has expressed concern that in response to research showing that depleting the moral muscle makes us more vulnerable to our impulsive desires, and how this depletion can be achieved, sometimes in surprising ways that people may not be aware of, marketers may begin to deliberately structure retail environments in ways that achieve exactly that. We may start to see selling techniques that carefully deplete self-control before the final consumer choice is made. Consumers might be invited to solve a difficult puzzle for a chance to win a prize, or be made to make a depleting number of decisions before the final consumer choice is made. If this happens, will we care? Earlier I asked you, is it ethical to manipulate the brain to weaken self-control so that people are more likely to fall back on their impulsive desires and behave in ways they would prefer not to behave? What was your answer? Why should it matter if the manipulation is of brains or of the environment if the effects are the same? Levy suggests that it doesn't seem to matter from a moral or a political point of view. If there are good reasons to be concerned about the first, there are equally good reasons to care about the second as well. My prediction is that as this research develops, marketers will become increasingly interested in using this new understanding of the weak spots of the automatic mind and self-control to reach into the mind and tip the balance in their behavior. So it is essential that marketers are not the only ones who pay attention to this research. Marketing that offers little chance of rationally resisting its influence rings ethical alarm bells, as philosopher Caroline West and others have argued, and as your own moral intuitions probably told you during the story of the neuroscientist. If marketers are updating their strategies in response to this new understanding of the mind's vulnerabilities, then so too must we respond. And this is not just so that we can properly assess the ethics of marketing tactics of the future, but also those that already exist. The kind of marketing that is targeted at children is perfectly geared to create impulsive desires for products and brands. It pairs the products with experiences, people, and characters that are fun, cool, and much loved. It's true that even quite young children can understand the persuasive purposes of marketing. But as marketing academic Agnes Nairn and I have asked, how does that help when marketing bypasses our rational capacities? And it turns out that older, more marketing-savvy children are no less influenced by advertising than younger, more naive children. Nan and I have argued that what's important and overlooked in the debate about the ethics of marketing to children is the child's ability to override the impulsive desires created by marketers. This ability resides in the moral muscle, and children, of course, are still developing this critical part of themselves. It's as though they fall into the hands of marketers, pre-treated with that self-control, depleting chemical spray. We all need to understand how what is outside the skull influences what goes on inside the skull, not just as consumers, but as policymakers and as a society. What do these insights into the mind imply for our autonomy and the ethics of environments that can undermine it? It is not the neuroscientific advances of the future that should concern us, but the potential use of the stimuli available in the here and now, the beautiful, the fun, the sexy, the depleting, the inconspicuous. It may be nothing more than a cute little puppy to you, but to someone who's trying to sell you something, it may be a way into your mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cordelia. Gracias.